The Good and the Evil, English translation, by Billy Edward Albert Meyer.
From time immemorial, the human being of the earth has known what is good and what is evil. However, ever since, he or she has always asked himself or herself the question whether he or she really, in every respect, actually also knew and understood this. And thus the question is whether the human being, in this day and age, is actually conscious of what he or she has to understand by good and evil in general. However, with very many, this is probably extremely doubtful. If, in particular, all the atrocities which are brought about and committed by human beings, such as wars, blatant misery and blatant need through felony, jealousy, strife, lovelessness, hate and interpersonal unconcernedness, as well as through terrorism,
murder, manslaughter, torture, and the death penalty, through lies, deception, and unhonesty, etc., are viewed and considered. Then it is actually questionable whether the knowledge and understanding in relation to good and evil still exists at all.
If the whole of good and evil is closely viewed and considered, then it is recognizable that, already at early times, the evil was spread far and wide and openly, whilst the good always had to be searched for and was only seldom found. The knowledge concerning where the dark energy and power of the evil came from was actually never explored by the human being, rather simply attributed to imbecilic religious sectarian legends, such as with the Christianity through the scare story of the apple from the tree of knowledge, which Eve is supposed to have picked and given Adam to eat, and whereby, in both, the knowledge of good and evil is supposed to have originated. A profoundly dumb-dull legend, which can have arisen only from a brain which has gone stupid, because, since time immemorial, the human being has known what is good and what is evil. Already at early times, when he or she became conscious of his or her rationality and his or her intellect, he or she was intelligence, intellect, rationality said, and therefore far enough developed rationally in order to recognize whether something was good or evil. Therefore, early on, he or she could therefore already ascertain, experience and comprehend from living experience that good and evil thoughts and feelings, desires, wishes and modes of behavior also led to correspondingly good or evil deeds and actions. Thus the human being was therefore already conscious early that his or her thoughts and feelings led him or her to do things which brought himself or herself, as well as the fellow human beings, great harm,
such as misery and need, pain, death, sorrow and destruction, etc. And the more selfish and imperious he or she became, the more he or she allowed the evil and removed himself or herself steadily further away from the good, because he or she just forgot to build up his or her better I.
This created unrest in him or her instead of calm and harmony, which he or she longs for, irrespective of his or her doings in the evil. When imprecisely viewed and considered, this is actually a paradox, however, rightly and precisely seen and understood. It is a question of a guideline in keeping with the creational natural laws and recommendations. Therefore, the human being must yield only to his or her inner impulsion and bring it into reality in order to not give priority and bring to fruition the evil, rather consistently the good and positive. The fact is that the dark energies and powers of evil and negative impulsations of desires, egoism, jealousy, stinginess,
greed and avarice, hate and lovelessness, revenge, pathological cravings, retribution, imaginations and wishes, etc., determine the thoughts and the feelings arising from them, as well as the attitudes, deeds, actions, and the modes of behavior coming forth from them.
And this happens inconsiderate of the fact that the human being knows in the deepest depth of his or her innermost nature, through the creational natural laws and recommendations, that he or she should be good and positive, but not evil and not negative. The universal prophet Nokodemian taught this already millions of years ago, just as he also explained that the human being should love and highly esteem himself or herself and his or her own kind in honor and dignity, as well as all the billion-fold different life forms and the whole of all creational existence. However, unfortunately, this teaching was lost to the human being already very early. Consequently, the evil could get the upper hand more and more, and the human being must first relearn to work himself or herself into this teaching, in order to perceive the creational natural laws and recommendations again, and to follow them, in order to change towards the better and the good.
He or she must learn and recognize that he or she shall love not only his or her fellow human beings as himself or herself, rather he or she must also become conscious of and capable of logically following that solely just the good and positive is of real, all-timely continuance.
It must become clear to him or her that if he or she has fallen into the dishonesty, the lie and the deception,
that he or she, if he or she does not consciously rid himself or herself of these, will remain a dishonest one, a liar and deceiver, just as a defiler will always remain a defiler, a violator always a violator, a thief always a thief, and an irascible one always an irascible one.
Only if a conscious change towards the good and positive is carried out can a true change along these lines result, if the evil and negative is cast aside. In this day and age, the human being lives continually more in the evil, as well as with the lie, and more excessive negative modes of behavior, which, however, he or she hardly or not at all notices. Television, periodicals, radio and newspapers are filled with sensational reports about assassinations, riots, arsons, deadly family dramas, torture, wars, murder, and mass murder, as well as ever-worsening natural catastrophes, robberies, revolutions, sexual felonies, terror and destructions of every kind. And the majority of the terrestrial humanity is completely unconcerned with it, because everything befalls surely not one's own person, rather unknown others. And what is more, all these inequities, all that which is read, heard and seen which is evil, negative, bad, and has gotten very badly out of the control of the good human nature, is greedily taken in and devoured, because it has somehow turned into a blatant, disgusting purpose in life. Consequently, hardly anyone at all is interested in the love, the good, peaceful, equalized, and harmonious. In the government, under the cloak of democracy, one's greedy for might as well as warmongers and even despots and tyrants, who do not shy away from allowing torture and the death penalty, as well as warlike and murderous secret service and military actions to be carried out on behalf of the state, are brought to the political helm, whereby innumerable innocent human beings are murdered. And all over the earth human beings are stolen, sold and treated as slaves by felonious organizations, namely over 42 million worldwide. Millions more live as other oppressed ones, and the majority of the terrestrial humanity is completely unconcerned towards them also. Either simply empty words are flailed about for them, or they will still be profited from, namely through mercenary or physical and psychical gavolt-based sexual deeds, right up to murder, or through the purchase of goods and wares, which are produced by slaves and oppressed ones, children as well as grown-ups, and find their way into the international trade. There are even entire peoples from third world countries systematically exploited, namely, by the country's own despots and tyrants, who act as governors, as well as also by firms and corporations from the industrial states, in which the human beings calmly and illustriously sit at overfilled tables and fill their bellies with all kinds of good foods and drinks. Naturally, every intelligent and rational human being knows what is good and evil, if he or she only rightly directs, keeps and nurtures his or her thoughts and feelings, and thus everyone knows in this form also that despotism, tyranny, and every other negative might is something evil in itself. However, irrespectively regarding this, everything is thoughtlessly accepted. However, the reason for it is to be found not far away, because the acceptance of the might as evil is founded in the wrong and negative thoughts and feelings of the human being, who craves his or her own evil, might, and does everything in order to strive for it, and also to be able to bring it to fruition. Therefore, the human being knows fundamentally very well what evil and what negative might in themselves are. However, he or she accepts that both are wielded both over himself or herself and over the fellow human beings, namely, therefore, only because he himself, she herself wants to wield evil and might over others. At least it is the case with an innumerable number in the majority of the terrestrial humanity. However, there are many who want neither the evil nor the might, which in itself is also evil. However,
Irrespectively, in the majority of the entire mass of humanity, they are only a minority group who, to the very best of its ability, lives according to the good and does much good. However, thereby cannot move the majority to the turning back to the better and good.
in the good and evil, the progress of the standard of living, the technology and the science is included also, of which the human being has become generally fascinated and all-round dependent. However, if everything is accurately viewed and considered in this regard, then, along with the good, also very much evil comes out of that, because everything entails death and destruction. The high standard of living alone is built upon a murderous attrition of human beings, who, with the production of food, as with the horticulture and agriculture of fruits, vegetables and herbs n.b., whereby especially also with the cultivation of plants for the clothing industry, monocultures are created, which must be maintained intensively with herbicides and pesticides, are heavily contaminated by poisons, and thereby miserably waste away and die. This happens entirely aside from the fact that thereby also children and grown-ups have to carry out slave labor under inhumane conditions, and are remunerated miserably for it, if at all. And the fact that also the sciences as well as the technology gets involved in any forms goes without saying, namely, along with the fact that in many forms death and destruction is contained therein, such as through exhaust gas emissions and other environmental poisoning, through wars and terror resulting from the use of technological and scientific achievements. Since time immemorial, the human being has never been admonished to make fruitful and subdue the earth through evil, through misery, need, and destruction, because, quite to the contrary, it was taught from the very beginning that he or she shall regard it as his or her partner, and care for, nurture, and never overpopulate it. From the very beginning, solely religions and sects preach that the human being shall subdue the earth, and he or she shall go forth in order to multiply in huge numbers. Consequently today, for the planet and the entire nature, as well as for the human and all other existence, an already dangerous and life-hostile situation has come about. Hence the human being has gone forth and has begun to destroy the earth.
The climate and the nature has already exterminated hundreds or even thousands of animals and other creatures, and is now robbing himself or herself of all necessities of life through the continuing, incessantly increasing overpopulation, and wiping himself or herself out.
As time progresses, the human being lives further away from all the creational natural laws and recommendations, whose existence he or she has no longer known for a long time already, and wherefore he or she has lost the capability to perceive them. Hence he or she does not know any longer what real true love, what peace and happiness and effective freedom and harmony are. Thus he or she preaches love, which he or she has long since forgotten what it is at all, whilst he or she sows lovelessness, disharmony, jealousy, hate, revenge, unpeace, retribution and destruction, however. Thus he or she speaks also megalomanically and ununderstandingly of peace, whilst he or she instigates and leads wars which endlessly demand countless human deaths and call forth monstrous destructions. Thus the deeds and actions of the human being of the earth stand in sharp contrast to his or her words of the love, and thereby the contradiction goes so far that he or she actually accepts his or her own mendacity as the truth, because he or she tells himself or herself his or her lies about love until he or she believes and champions them as the truth. Thereby everything good is shoved to one side and into the background to such an extent that it dissolves and vanishes, whilst the evil can work mightfully in the foreground. Thus lovelessness, hate, jealousy, torture, envy and avarice, as well as stinginess, revenge, the death penalty and retribution are acknowledged by the human beings and in the entire society, as well as by the law, and turned into defended modes of behavior, whereby also the jurisdiction deteriorates more and more into a blatant farce. Thus for a long time already it has been happening that, in the next one, honest willingness to help and true love for the next one is reviled, and is pilloried as buying of the next one. Or, if he or she relinquishes his or her property in order to do something good with it, and help the poor, that a human being must expect that he or she is brought to accountability, and is patronized, if not even stuck in a mental institution. The truth is, the human being is not evil in his or her creational natural innermost nature. Thus he or she is therefore also not evil from his or her youth onwards. Rather he or she evolves first to the evil through his or her thoughts and feelings, from which corresponding attitudes and modes of behavior arise. And as a rule, their emergence leads back to the influences of the education and the environment. Hence, the human being is made evil on the one hand through external human influences, and on the other hand through himself or herself, that is to say, through his or her own thoughts and feelings. Thereby the familial, acquaintance-based, environmental, as well as the educational, economic, societal, and political influences, as well as religious sectarian influences, each play a decisive role. Therefore, it is necessary that these circumstances are changed, namely, through those human beings who still perceive the creational natural laws and recommendations and are able to put them into practice. Thereby it is their duty to instruct the majority of that mass in the correct form, which have fallen away from the good, and which tend to the evil. However, these cannot be changed through words and punishments, because a change for the better they can do only for themselves and put it into practice for the sake of the good. Now, the good and evil in the human being is a theme which is practically as old as the humanity itself, since it has achieved rationality and intellect. And the fact is also that the human being cannot be changed in all of his or her behaviors, as well as in his or her attitudes, because this in particular only he or she is able to do entirely for himself or herself alone. Hence each human being must change himself or herself to the good, and, in himself or herself, carry the principle of hope that he or she can and will also do this. There are no hard and fast recipes for this, because as the human being is individual in and of himself or herself, so are any of his or her approaches in relation to himself or herself, and his or her self-formation and self-realization also individual. Fundamentally, only impulses and advice in relation to the entire or partial human behavior are able to be given, by attempting to make comprehensible to the human being that he or she must learn to differentiate between good and evil himself or herself, in order to bring only the good and the positive to effect. Thereby it must also become clear that the tension between good and evil, in the behavior of the human being, in the community, and in the societal structure, must be thought through and made clear, in order to understand the whole in general. It is also unavoidable for the human being to fathom, to check, and to learn to understand the relationship to himself or herself, because only when this is made visible as well can a real conscious effort and an understanding occur of how shady the evil ultimately and actually is. It must never be that the evil happens by itself. Rather, the insight must prevail that, at the end, always only the good gets a chance, and everything is encouraged in a good form, because only the good and positive in the life conduct brings real benefit and evolutive progress. However, the fact is that the human being lives continually in an area of tension between good and evil, whereby he or she determines himself or herself which side he or she wants to turn to. Fundamentally, namely, he or she has a free will, according to which he or she can determine everything himself or herself, and also can form his or her thoughts and feelings as well as his or her attitudes, opinions, deeds, actions, and modes of behavior himself or herself. This is his or her pre-given creational natural right in this respect, through which he or she, without exception, determines himself or herself what he or she wants to do and allow, and what he or she wants to continue to do or relinquish. It is undoubtable that the human being of today is confronted daily and often hourly and even every minute with questions and problems which often make it very difficult for him or her to recognize the boundary between good and evil. However, nevertheless, he or she must make an effort to recognize the boundary in every single case. This is a safety line, so to speak, which must be recognized and which must not be crossed, namely, also not when it appears only difficult to recognize, indistinct, muddled, or undefinable. However, if a vigilant attentiveness and perception is nurtured, then, to each question and to each problem, a corresponding personal opinion to the case can be made, and the exact boundary between good and evil can be recognized and defined. And if it is attentively dealt with in this form, then in the face of tricky questions and problems, and in the face of everything which has gotten very badly out of the control of the good human nature and is terrifying, which happens in the world, good and evil can be decided between, and their boundary can be found. And the fact is that not only the evil rules the world and the human beings, rather that also the good is present at all times, it happens and has a millionfold effect. The voice of the evil, indeed, screams always very loudly all round. However, if attention is granted to what moves inwardly together with that as well, then, in the face of all the negative and evil that has gotten very badly out of the control of the good human nature, very much good is still perceived, even if the good is active very often only in a quiet form. However, this quiet form of the good needs the entire quietness of the good and positive thoughts and feelings, because only if these are able to be nurtured calmly and quietly can also the effective good and positive be perceived, recognized, understood, and also put into practice by the human being. This also means that the human being must recognize himself or herself, thus also the good, enlightening and valueful, as well as the evil, dark and compulsive in himself or herself. Because only if he or she makes an effort to do this and also to carry this out, can he or she gain control of everything and also really do the good, which he or she actually wants.
Simyase Silver Star Center, the 27th of October 2013, 1818 HRS, Billy.
The good and the evil.
If the human being knows not what is good and evil, how shall he or she then know how he or she shall behave in the good and positive? If the human being knows not how he or she shall help himself or herself, how can he or she then know how he or she shall help other human beings?
Simyase Silver Star Center, the 27th of October 2013, 1820 HRS, Billy.